Good morning. I begin this presidential address by acknowledging the Cadigal peoples of the AARE Nation, who are the traditional owners of this land, and their elders, past, present, and future. I'd also like to acknowledge the delegates to this joint conference from the Australian Association for Research in Education, the Asia Pacific Education Research Association, and the World Education Research Association. This is a landmark event because it brings together in many ways, for the first time, I think in the Southern Hemisphere, educational researchers and leaders from the major educational research associations from around the world. It's in this very international forum, in one of the world's most multicultural cities, that I think it's an auspicious time to begin a reflective and strategic conversation about the place of culture in the future of educational research. In this address, I'd like to open up this conversation by presenting three propositions. First is that educational research faces a fundamental conundrum, and that culture warrants our serious attention as a shared conceptual concern amongst educational researchers. And third, that addressing this conundrum and taking culture seriously means rethinking how we do educational research and think about educational research as a discipline. I'd like to preface this conversation, though, by explaining how I come to it with a particular set of knowledges and a set of experiences. My doctorate was an interdisciplinary study based in sociology, history, and anthropology in the area of race relations. I used, however, as the focus of this research, as the lens for viewing research, race relations, the life of a particular missionary, an Anglican missionary to the Aborigines, a guy called Ernest Gribble. And I used his life as a window into the history of the race relations from the end of the 19th century to the second half of the 20th century. Now, in doing this work, I not only used the traditional sorts of documents that you might use for this sort of historical and anthropological work, policy analysis, documentary archives, newspapers, but also the daily diary Gribble kept for his 60 years as a missionary. But I also spent a fair bit of time doing fieldwork in remote Aboriginal communities in Northern Australia, where he was actually located, and doing interviewing and collecting life histories from many of the people that he worked with, most of whom were the first generation of the stolen generation, the group that we call the Aboriginal children who were forcibly removed from their families and relocated on missions and reserves. Now, this work generated two central arguments. The first, that cultures and their distinguishing features are constantly changing, and second, that any interaction between groups affects all members of all groups. Now, nowadays, these arguments seem familiar, perhaps even mundane. At the time, they were controversial. Perhaps a little bit naively, just at graduation, I agreed to do a radio interview for the University of Queensland as part of their profiling of new PhD students. All the Aboriginal media ran and commended the story, but there are outcries from when it hit the mainstream white media. I was actually so traumatised by this response that it took Alan and Unwin nearly a decade to persuade me to actually publish the PhD. And it was a pretty courageous act on their part, and I probably would have backed out if they'd actually told me that particular white interests had threatened them with legal prosecution if they proceeded. So I bring this background and my experience as a secondary school teacher to my work as an academic in education. For most of this career, I've focused on how issues of cultural diversity have played out in educational policy, curriculum, and practice. I also come to this conversation about the conceptual concerns of educational research as a result of my thinking and work on our collective futures as president of AARE and my involvement in APERA and WERA. And it strikes me that educational research is facing a fundamental conundrum. Everywhere around the globe, education's a priority. Individuals, communities, nation-states, supranational agencies like UNESCO, OECD, the World Bank, look to education to shape our economic, social and political futures. At the same time, in many countries, educational research is at a crossroads. What it stands for, who it serves, and what its future might be is far from clear. This is especially true in Australia, in the UK, but also in parts of North America, and there are also symptoms in Europe and Asia and elsewhere. The consequence is anxiety in schools and faculties of education in universities, and uncertainty beyond universities, particularly within research funding bodies in Australia, our Australian Research Council, about the distinctiveness and merits of much educational research. So my question is, how did we come to be in this particular place? To answer this, I think we just have to look at recent history. Education emerged in universities as a multidisciplinary field. But the world has changed. And this has shifted how we need to think about the ontology of educational research and about what it defines us and makes us distinctive as a discipline. These changes include worldwide transformations in the purpose and operation of universities, demographic changes in the academic workforce, and particularly the retirement of that large number of discipline experts who joined education in the 70s and 80s, the flourishing of what Hoyle calls a turn to the practical in education research and practice, and increasing research on teaching and learning in disciplines and academic units outside of the historical home of faculties and schools of education. At the same time, new communities have emerged that have enriched education by bringing different epistemologies, theories and methods. I'm thinking particularly of feminism, post-structuralism, sociocultural theory, but also more recently, education economics. Other communities with a substantive interest in educational issues, particularly teaching and learning, have emerged in nursing, law, marketing, accounting, business, chiropractic education. The slide behind me illustrates just some of the diverse disciplines whose journals were classified as part of the education discipline in Australia's 2012 education research exercise. But these aren't Australian journals. These are international, and they tell a global story about the educational landscape. They are also, however, extremely ethnocentric because they are actually only the English language journals. Now, each of the different communities that has emerged over the last decades in educational research has a very vibrant intellectual life through their own journals and often through their own societies and conferences. But their numbers are relatively small. They often speak different languages and have limited interaction with each other. And most lack the presence in undergraduate and postgraduate programs to have really significant impact on the world of practice. Our good friend John Furlong from BERA suggests that there are three reasons why we need to open up these different communities. First, their intellectual contributions risk atrophying if they lack the critical mass to debate and revise their theories, methods and epistemologies. Secondly, regardless of the value of their contributions, any community can only offer a partial framing of any educational problem, and this limits the questions that we can ask, and I'd propose the answers we can get on any complex educational issue. And finally, many of these communities struggle to make a case about the importance of their contribution to the applied work that's at the heart of education, and education needs to do this to survive in the current political economy of research. I'd actually add a fourth reason. These communities offer us secure homes, but to outsiders looking across the full gamut of educational research, we often seem like a conceptually chaotic, balkanised field. Of course, there are exceptions. Many individual researchers are very highly regarded and exercise considerable sway over these outsiders. Quite a number of them are in this room. But there are the exceptions to the general rule. And regardless of the counter-arguments we might pose, we can't ignore the fact that these perceptions by these outsiders matter, because they're the decision makers in universities, departments of education, research funding councils, who shape the conditions of possibility of our work. and the political influence of educational research and researchers in the public domain. The fundamental conundrum facing educational research, I think, re-summons the question that Bill Green asked in his contribution to the AARE Symposium on the Future of Educational Research. What is the distinctive knowledge project of educational research? How does this knowledge project relate to practice in the different sites where educational researchers work, including, but not exclusively, schools and teacher education? Now, this topic has triggered lively debate ranging from the social realist arguments of people like Michael King and his colleague, through to calls for recognition of less hegemonic forms of knowledge and a better understanding of how the interrelationships between different knowledge systems work, put forward by people like Raewyn Connell, Bill Green, Deng and Luke. But the debate's ongoing, and the very fact that it's ongoing underlines our need to clarify and to be explicit, to paraphrase David Bridges, about the discipline of our discipline. What this would involve is clearly articulating the shared foci, concepts and structures of inquiry that are education's way of knowing the world, that define education as a discipline and its warrant for serious attention in the public and domain. One productive entry point for opening up our conversation about the identity of education as a discipline is by asking, what is it that unites rather than divides us? Regardless of our research specialisations, our methodological expertise, our focus on specific areas of practice, be they early childhood, health education, lifelong learning, educational researchers do share some common concerns. Two of these are pedagogy and learning. Another, I'd argue, is our shared political project, that is the capacity of education to build socially just societies. An area that I believe straddles and links these common concerns is the conceptual lens of culture in the educational enterprise. Now, culture is a complex concept. Sociologist Raymond Williams described it as one or two of the most complicated words in the English language. It's a concept that dates back to classical antiquity, and different scholars from different disciplines with different epistemological viewpoints have wrestled with this concept. It's complicated in popular terms because we use it to describe different things. A society within a specific organisation or geographical boundary, in a biological sense, as a descriptor for racial or ethnic groups, as a concrete category of a collective body of intellectual work, or to differentiate between different subgroups, youth culture, queer culture, teaching cultures. I'm using culture in this particular address with a heritage that draws on anthropology and has been taken up by sociology. And that is culture as what constructs particular social categories. This meaning doesn't conceive of culture as merely about particular objects and things, although these are instrumental in the formation of cultures. I'm talking of Raymond Williams' notion of culture as a whole way of life of a particular group. Now, at first glance, this notion of culture might just seem too big, too unwieldy to be a useful conceptual lens or analytical tool for education. But it's a meaning that encompasses, I think, three areas of practice: the symbolic, material and behavioural, all of which are relevant to education. Each can be individually examined and analysed, but it's how these actually combine and work together as a process of experience that is critical in the formation and constitution of social groups and categories. It's for this reason that Jonathan Friedman described culture in his book Cultural Identity and Global Processes as a process embodied in experience, as the social at work. Or perhaps more accessibly, as Richard Sennett said, culture's the values and practices that glue a people together, even if they don't know each other or live in the same geographic area. Educational researchers, however, have always had a particular educational take on culture. Our focus has been on its pedagogical power and the way it instructs, inducts and sustains individuals into particular social groups, particularly learning environments. History matters in the identity of any discipline, and a concern with culture has a well-established history in educational research. It's preoccupied some of the big names across all areas of education. These include Pierre Bourdieu, Basil Bernstein in sociology of education, Jerome Bruner in educational psychology, Freire, Grew, Arowitz in critical pedagogy, Andy Hargraves in educational leadership, and on. This is an illustrative, not a representative list, but it traces a cartography of concern with culture in education. Now, much of this early writing was by scholars whose formative intellectual years were in the 60s and 70s. In countries like Australia, this was a time when we still believed in the possibility of freedom, when there was something left of the left and it didn't just live in Fitzroy, Melbourne, and overturning the establishment seemed possible. When there were student riots and sit-ins, civil rights campaigns for racial equality, successful resistance to the Vietnam War, and the social transformation in gender relations as a result of second-wave feminism and the women's liberation movement. Now, we shouldn't romanticise this time. This was also the time before citizenship rights for Indigenous Australians, before the High Court's Mabo decision on Aboriginal land rights, when homosexuality was still a criminal offence, when 20% of Cambodians were killed under Pol Pot, and when the USSR invaded Czechoslovakia and squashed the Prague Spring. But nevertheless, it was also a time in education of deep commitment and belief in the possibility of social change. And this was the hallmark of our work in educational research. It built on the work of progressive educators like Dewey, Green, Freire, and this was the time when educational researchers alerted us to the importance that learning which must build on the cultures, experiences and knowledges of the learners, and when they foregrounded how school cultures produced and reproduced social and economic divisions in society, and how important education was in disrupting these to change the social order. It was also the time when scholars, some in this room, alerted us to the power of public pedagogies and to the educational work done by cultural practices beyond the classroom, particularly through advertising, television, the media and other forms of technology. Excuse me. Now, culture's clout as a conceptual focus for educational research languished with the disintegration of economic socialism and as other ideologies infiltrated universities and reshaped educational research and researchers. These are familiar and don't need to be labelled. I'll label them, they don't need to be laboured. Economic neoliberalism of the free market, education as human capital development for the knowledge economies, the ascendancy of procedural rationality, and science as the authoritative methods for knowing the social world. But it's for exactly these reasons that culture is important for educational researchers. It shapes the culture in which we work and the work we do. These cultural changes aren't just imposed on us, we're complicit in their construction and in sustaining them. Think about research assessment exercises and ethics review. Technology has been one of the most significant cultural changes in academia. It's enabled greater sharing, connection and integration across groups, and it's formed new academic communities. I was thrilled and delighted that as a consequence of Twitter, one of our colleagues is organising AARE Fringe with a whole group of teachers at a pub somewhere in the local area. As technology increasingly networks educational researchers globally, there will be two cultural challenges. First, how to avoid the homogenising, totalising effects that can occur when cultures of different sizes and influences interact. Second, how to build effective relations across cultures, particularly when culture is not a static concept or place. And when we think about it, what's at stake here is actually an ethical issue. It's about the moral grammar of social relations. So why is culture significant for educational research? At a global level, culture is a prime public policy and governance issue. It's clear in the priorities that policymakers have put on educational relations as a result of the worsening political climate following September 11, and the conflicts that are arising from the unprecedented cultural diversity in societies as a result of transnational migration and globalisation. And I'd also add, particularly here in Australia, we've felt the importance of culture as a consequence of the shift in the geopolitical and economic centre of the world to Asia. We see these issues of cultural diversity in a daily basis played out in our schools, universities and cities. Supranational agencies have put the ball clearly in the court of education for managing the issues of cultural diversity. In 2008, UNESCO issued its Universal Declaration on Cultural Understanding. Sorry, that was in 2001. In 2008, it followed up with a rainbow paper on intercultural dialogue that described the role of education as, and I'm quoting, the first and foremost place for encouraging intercultural dialogue in every age group and across the full spectrum of educational provision. Anxiety is entangled in this agenda. As the UNESCO report on investing in cultural diversity and intercultural dialogue argued, without intercultural competencies for life in a global world, misunderstandings rooted in identity issues are liable to proliferate. Now, just leaving aside, just for the moment, our academic debates and discussions about the problematics of the meaning and the possibilities of intercultural understanding and dialogue, similar sentiments have been echoed in various policy documents on multiculturalism, cultural diversity, intercultural understanding around the world. This is a global concern. Now, at the national level, culture is at the heart of education as a nation-building enterprise, particularly in schooling. In Australia, for example, the Melbourne Declaration is a statement of the nationally agreed goals of schooling for all young Australians. And you see on the screen there the emphasis it places on schooling as a nation-building exercise, including attention to issues of cultural diversity and our Indigenous cultures. The formal school curriculum is a key instrument for building a shared national culture. We see this clearly in the civics and citizenship curriculum in countries like Australia, France, England, Norway, and Indonesia, in moral education curriculum in countries like Malaysia, in national education curriculum of China. Formal school policy and curriculum, however, sit alongside very other powerful cultures. In schools, for example, these are the cultures the students bring from their homes, families and communities, and that are recast in schools through the traditions, rituals, values and behaviours that schools cultivate, and the benefits and rewards that flow from attending a particular school. The differences in school cultures are vivid in any comparison of elite and non-elite schools. And these translate into intergenerational transmission of economic and social advantage that constructs class distinctions within society and is therefore of concern to education given our social justice agenda. But what about at the individual level? And in relation to schools, what about the kids? Research across a range of disciplines agrees that culturally inclusive learning environments have positive impacts on student outcomes and educational practice, create richer, more complex social and learning environments that enhance complex thinking, better prepare young people for a global economy and society. On the other hand, poor intercultural relations in schools, increasingly increased social exclusion and disconnection, are strongly related to poor academic outcomes and contribute to increased mental and general health problems, including poor social and emotional well-being, depression and anxiety. So returning to my first culture warrants serious attention from educational researchers because It's an international and national priority in public policy, education and curriculum. It exercises pedagogical power that shapes particularly kids, but all learners, who they are and give their sense of how they belong to a particular social group. It impacts on the educational outcomes and life chances of young people, and because the work of culture is deeply implicated in education's social justice agenda. I want to develop this point a little bit further by sharing with you two educational narratives about the work of two particular teachers. Let me introduce you to Mother Joseph Michael. On your right, with the bag. Okay, Mother Joseph Michael was my grade 5 teacher. It's telling that she is one of the very few teachers whose name I actually recall from the very many that I've had in my life. Mother Joseph Michael was a very stern woman, but I don't actually ever remember her raising her voice at us. Certainly not in anger. She didn't need to. She had a glare that could cut right through you. Now, Mother Joseph Michael was, of course, a Roman Catholic nun who adhered to a set of religious practices and beliefs that are very different from those of today's contemporary society. But even in her day, Mother Joseph Michael was a dinosaur. She was probably only in her 50s when she taught us, but we were pretty convinced that she had to have been at least 100. Now, part of this was because Mother Joseph Michael steadfastly refused to comply with the recent decree by her religious order that all the nuns were to use the modern habit. This is a light grey dress, knee length, with a short veil that exposed the hair. Mother Joseph Michael doggedly insisted on continuing to wear the full-length, thick, black wooden garb designed in the 1800s, complete with a scapular, enclosed headdress and waist-length veil. Mother Joseph Michael was also a pedagogical dinosaur. She dismissed the new maths. We memorised our times tables, did quizzes, and there were no marks for getting the answer right, getting the working out right if the answer was wrong. She also rejected the newfangled idea of process writing. We did weekly spelling bees, learnt our parts of speech, parsed sentences interminably. I remember distinctively not enjoying this style of teaching or learning, but I think of her with great gratitude every time I see the glazed look in my postgraduate students' eyes when I suggest that they use the active voice. Now, Mother Joseph Michael's resistance to curriculum innovation triggered clashes with our new principal. She was a fresh young thing, straight from university, determined to bring the school into the 20th century. Mother Joseph Michael refused to change her ways. Ultimately, they came to a blow over something far less educationally important, and that was the matter of afternoon naps. Mother Joseph Michael was a great believer, particularly in the heat of the Sydney summer, of the entire class having an afternoon nap for half an hour immediately after lunch. Our principal believed that this was far too childish for grade 5s and we should be busy learning. And she stood her ground on this particular issue. Eventually, Mother Joseph Michael capitulated, but she immediately instituted a daily visit, straight after lunch, to the cool, dark convent chapel, where we were instructed to put our heads on the pews and close our eyes for half an hour. Mother Joseph Michael also didn't like contract cleaners. Every other class in the school had cleaners who came through once a week, not our class. We had a cleaning roster and everybody had a job, wiping the desks, shaking out the doormat, sweeping the floor, tidying the bookshelves. For 30 minutes last thing on Friday, Mother Joseph Michael donned her pinafore. Do you remember those pinafores? And we'd all get to work. She'd lead the way and keep a watchful eye out so that as soon as any of us completed our task, we'd be assigned to help a colleague, a classmate who'd lagged behind. Now, in hindsight, getting all 25 of us to actually do a job and perform it to Mother Joseph Michael's exacting standards was a pretty impressive piece of classroom management. Then just before the final bell, we'd be instructed to sit in our desks and to look around and admire what it was we had accomplished. It was always a group achievement. No one was ever singled out, but there was always a recognition of initiatives that weren't part of the planned roster. Dusting the top of the lockers, cleaning the door handles, tidying the painting smocks. And during the week, we'd each think very hard about how to make a small but new contribution to this collective class effort. Another memory stands out from those years. Like every Roman Catholic classroom around the world, there was always in the corner a plaster of Paris statue of Mary, Mother of Jesus. In most cases, these are dust collectors, not in Mother Joseph Michael's class. She kept a treasure trove of items in the bottom drawer that were full of scraps of cloth that could be transformed into veils, cloaks for Mary, mats for her to stand on, assorted collections of little vases, scraps of ribbon, bows and tinsel. All of these were cast-offs that had been lovingly salvaged by her, hemmed and preserved. Every month, 2 students would be selected to dress the altar. The criterion for selection, of course, was good behaviour, something that Mother Joseph Michael always reminded us of whenever we got fractious. Although it wasn't until I was finally chosen, I seem to recall in about the second last month of the year, that I worked out that all she'd been doing was choosing 2 students from each end of the alphabet and working her way towards the middle. Now, on the one hand, the dressing of the altar was a very childish dress-up game. On the other hand, she always used this monthly event as an opportunity to engage us in a significant social event, for which she could always manage to find some sort of related colour. Of course, the big religious holidays, Christmas and Easter, always got a mention. But this was 1968. In April, the altar was draped in black and we learned about civil rights and mourned the assassination of Martin Luther King. In May, we learned about student rights in Paris and dressed the altar in red, white and blue. In October, we learnt the history of the Olympics and the altar was dressed in Mexico's colours. As a consequence of this ritual, we all became avid followers of the daily news, all keen to be the one to identify the next big event that would be the subject of the dressing of the altar. Let me share with you another example, a more contemporary one. This is Pamela. There's no picture of Pamela. We don't have ethics approval to identify her. Pamela teaches in one of the primary schools that my team from Deakin University have been working with as part of a major study we've just completed on starting to begin the sort of work done by teachers working in the area of Asia literacy. This study is part of a wider policy and political context. It was conducted for the Australian Government and for the Australian Institute for Standards in Teaching and Leadership, the national body that sets and oversees standards for teachers and principals. The study comes out of the Australian Government's policy priority to build an Asia literate citizenry for an Asian century, and the introduction of the national curriculum in which Asia is a mandatory priority area to be studied by all students in all Australian schools. Pamela grew up in Canada, in Quebec, speaking English but learnt French at school and is now an Australian citizen. A global citizen, you could say. She teaches and coordinates Indonesian languages across all classes in her school, which is a large K-9 school located in a major city growth corridor, with a student body who are predominantly from countries in Asia. Pamela is also school coordinator of Studies of Asia, and that means that she's responsible for equipping other teachers with the skills to integrate Indonesian language and Studies of Asia into their teaching. When she took on these roles, Pamela was a novice in Indonesian, and admits at this particular stage she was barely a lesson ahead of the kids. But she took a course in Indonesian language, hosted Indonesian exchange visits, and went on a study tour to Indonesia. It's a different story today. Her school's now a regular feature on the Department of Education's website as an exemplar for innovative teaching in Indonesian language. Now, Pamela uses popular culture as her vehicle for teaching. One of the tasks that she did with her Year 8 students and their teachers was to construct an episode of MasterChef, that global popular TV cooking program. The students purchased food from a simulated market, bargaining in Indonesian with the shopkeepers who were the roles played by the school's Indonesian teachers. They cooked nasi goreng and discussed the dish in Indonesian. They served it to the judges, their Indonesian-speaking teachers, who assessed their cooking in Indonesian. The students' assessment task was to translate the judges' comments in Indonesian back into English. Now, Pamela is also responsible for organising the professional learning for the teachers in her school to build their knowledge of Asia. And she does this by running quizzes modelled on the TV show Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? She's also established a biannual Asia Week, where everything in the entire school is devoted to issues Asian. And the parents, guests, and come in and take classes, lead activities, and share their cultural expertise. Now, as educational researchers, we could use one of many disciplinary lenses for looking at these stories. For example, Mother Joseph Michael's story might be entree to examining the history of education in Australian schooling and the role of the Catholic Church, or curriculum changes and teachers' responses, or for a Foucauldian analysis of the disciplining work of moral technologies in the classroom and how students interiorise these and take them up in the conduct of the self. Pamela's story opens up issues about educational policy and its impact and practice, about pedagogy, quality teaching, teaching standards, and about the construction of Asia in the imaginary and classrooms of Australia. These different lenses provide valuable insights, but none individually captures the subjective and cumulative effects of living these narratives of education. None captures the totality of the educational experience and the ways in which different values and practices combined in the work of both these teachers to create cultures that constructed political communities, particular communities, in Mother Joseph Michael's class, or in the case of Pamela, a school committed to working to be engaged in becoming Asia literate. This is the work that culture does. But understanding this work requires attention not only to the radical contextual, as Guru described, but also to the dialogical relationship between the local and the broader macro-level forces at the organisational, national and global level. Our re-engagement with the totality, the cultures of educational experience, I believe is particularly necessary as policy agendas increasingly encourage education to slice and dice its practice into increasingly smaller variables, units for assessing values, as David Berliner explained yesterday, value-adding outcomes, teaching standards and test scores. We're at risk of focusing so much on the trees we're not seeing the forest. So returning to my first proposition, culture warrants our serious attention because it focuses on how the symbolic, material and behavioural practices in teaching and learning are experienced, how they work together and how they're related to broader social, economic and political developments and have particular effects on individuals and communities. Now, in this final section, I want to return to the matter of educational discipline and bring together my two themes of a conundrum and culture. Resolving the conundrum confronting educational research and articulating the discipline of our discipline will involve three strategic moves, at the very least, in which we do culture. I want to illustrate how we might do this by using culture as a conceptual lens and by drawing on the work of our ARC project on intercultural understanding in primary and secondary schools. These moves are familiar and used by many of us, but the extent to which they are a modus operandi, a defining feature of our knowledge project and our disciplinary practice, is a very different matter. And that's the conversation I'd like to open up. To be a politically viable and influential discipline, we need to be strategic. And I believe that that means that methodological pluralism has to become a defining way of knowing in the discipline of education. And this will require us to increasingly combine our respective strengths in different methods and approaches. There are two reasons for my thinking here. First, methodological silos aren't a sustainable long-term option. We need to combine our respective methodological expertise to tackle the big challenges in educational research. And secondly, research impact matters, not just in terms of bibliometrics, publications and citation outputs, but in terms of how our research improves the lives of real people through the knowledge we generate, the theories we develop, the educational interventions that make a difference. The impact of our research has to be a priority because of our common concern with ensuring that education builds socially just societies. This is the moral argument. The pragmatic one is that research impact worries governments and research funding councils around the world. This is a political reality. In the current political economy of educational research, it's a reality we can't ignore. Using as an example our ARC on intercultural understanding, we needed multiple methods in order to understand and explain the cultural complexities of intercultural understanding in different sites. Finely grained ethnographies tell us about the lived experience of cultural relations amongst young people and how and why education and intercultural understanding education is taken up differently in different sites, different schools and by different teachers. But it's only large statistical analyses that will tell us about the national relationships between intercultural understanding and schooling outcomes, socioeconomic advantage and disadvantage, and how these are similar and different across different communities. Taking up methodological pluralism as an identifying feature of education's way of knowing will require respectful conversations about epistemology and the strengths and limitations of different disciplines and methods. But tolerance of these sorts of conversations within different disciplines are common in other fields, like sociology, geography, and economics. Interdisciplinary alliances, I think, are also going to be increasingly strategically necessary, given the range of different disciplines publishing in the broad field of education. But I think for more reasons than that. Interdisciplinarity is important in education because what happens in education settings is so often closely entwined with the work that's happening elsewhere in other disciplines, like economics and in health. This is particularly in relation to issues of culture, but I'd also argue in relation to our other areas of common concern, like teaching and learning. In our Intercultural Understanding ARC, we've brought together scholars from 6 different disciplines: education, health, psychology, humanities, social science, and mathematics. Intercultural understanding is a big question, and it needs interdisciplinary expertise to unravel its complexities. But there are some other reasons too. First, interdisciplinary research is often at the forefront of innovation, and education needs to lead the way. The second is that interdisciplinary engagement compels us to continually reflect and reconsider our own disciplinary identity in relation to those of the other disciplines. And this is a necessary part, an important part of being a serious academic discipline and not merely a commodity for the world of practice. Each discipline creates its own technical vocabulary that is specific to its expertise, its jargon. But as Walter Nash reminded us, in his book Jargon, Its Uses and Abuses. Jargon is not only shop talk, it can also be show talk, a means of impressing and sometimes mystifying the uninitiated. If educational research is going to have persuasive power with those outsiders beyond our discipline whose perspectives matter, then we're going to need to use new forms of language to engage them. I'm not recommending that all educational research reports be reduced to a 10-second soundbite. In fact, I'm having that argument with a particular funding body at the moment. But we are going to need to make increasing use of new technology, Twitter, Facebook, blogs, but particularly, I think, to think creatively about representing our research visually. This is something that the sciences do brilliantly. These sorts of modes of communication don't count in research assessment exercises, but they make complex research comprehensible to outsiders. Let me give you an example. In our ARC, one of the things that we were really worried about was how we could actually communicate the research findings in an accessible way to the large number of policymakers and practitioners who are connected with the project in different ways. We've done this by trying to apply the principles of methodological pluralism and interdisciplinarity by teaming up with a maths expert in geoinformation spatial technology. GIS is a tool that comes out of mathematics and geography. It translates data, geocoded data, into maps. It's actually what you see every day when you see those moving maps during the weather forecast on television. What you see on the screen at the moment is a static example of GIS. In this particular case, it's a visual representation of the number of cinemas that were closed in different historical time periods in the Melbourne area. Now, if you look at those time periods, you'll find that the expansion of cinemas was post-58, in the post-war period, and the decline, subsequent decline, was as people got colour television, DVDs, other forms of technology. So these maps not only tell us about geography, but they tell us about social transformation within particular regions. Now, we're using this sort of technology in our ARC to try and visually represent some of the changes in intercultural understanding in schools and the impact of particular innovations. Now, many of us use these sorts of tools. They're not unfamiliar. We've got extensive experience in these forms of communication in our community. My point here is that we actually need to harness this expertise so that accessible communication as a particular form of knowledge becomes a defining quality of our discipline. Now, what I've tried to sketch out in this address is not only an argument about the value of culture as a unifying conceptual lens for educational research, but some of the reasons why I feel a cultural change is necessary for educational research to clearly articulate its shared foci, concepts and structures of inquiries that define our way of knowing and our identity as a discipline in a changing world. This is just a small contribution to a much larger conversation. It's part of important work being conducted on this topic around the world. In Australia, by the team involved in the AARE ACDE project on strategic capacity building for educational research. And my heartfelt thanks goes to this team for their contributions to this debate, and to Peter Goodyear and our late colleague Alison Lee for their leadership of this project. I encourage you all to read their report and papers as these emerge, and I look forward to the ongoing international conversation. Thank you.